She never imagined she'd find solace in a creature so humble, yet there it was, her only true companion in a life that had grown unbearably quiet. Married young, she'd thought the world would unfurl before her in all its beauty and possibility. But dreams of love and laughter had slowly given way to a stark, unspoken loneliness. Her husband, once attentive, had turned distant over the years, his once warm presence now cold and detached, his mind seemingly consumed by work and the countless chores of their rural life. In her husband's absence, both physical and emotional, the donkey filled a silent void. She hadn't planned on becoming attached to it. It was just an animal after all. Yet, something in the donkey's gentle gaze and steady presence comforted her, a quiet companionship that asked for nothing and gave so much in return. It was there when she needed a listener, standing patiently as she whispered her thoughts, dreams, and regrets into the soft breeze of dusk. Her husband had little regard for the creature. To him, it was another mouth to feed, another burden on his long list of responsibilities. He would sneer whenever she spent time near it, muttering under his breath, dismissing her affection as foolishness. But she couldn't explain it to him. He wouldn't understand. The donkey represented something he couldn't give her. Understanding without judgment, a balm to her soul that she hadn't known she needed. She took to visiting the donkey more frequently, letting the quiet moments of their time together soothe her growing sense of isolation. As the days passed, her visits became more secretive, like a cherished ritual she held close to her heart. She would slip away, her heart quickening as she made her way to the quiet spot where the donkey grazed. No one knew of these stolen moments. They were hers alone, a private world hidden from her husband, a world that held a sense of intimacy she hadn't experienced in years. In those quiet moments, as she ran her fingers through the donkey's rough mane, she felt something stir inside her that she had long believed forgotten. In the stillness, she would confess her worries, her dreams, her sadness. And though the donkey couldn't reply, she imagined that it listened, offering a silent solidarity that her husband had long ceased to give. She didn't feel guilty for keeping this bond a secret. In fact, she felt liberated, as if she were reclaiming a small piece of herself that had been lost in the routine of marriage. The bond grew inexplicably into something profound and irreplaceable, something she didn't fully understand herself. She found herself drawn to the donkey more with each passing day. There was a strange peace in its presence, something grounding and real. Her life had become a series of silent compromises, small sacrifices that chipped away at her without her even noticing. But the donkey gave her a reason to step away from all of that, to feel something she couldn't quite explain. She knew it wasn't normal to seek comfort in an animal, to find herself looking forward to those quiet moments where she could simply be, without expectations or demands. Each visit felt like an escape. She'd sit by the donkey in the late afternoon sun, letting her mind wander to places she hadn't allowed herself to go in years. The weight of unspoken thoughts and buried dreams slipped away as she shared them, one by one, in the safety of her silent companion. There was no judgment, no dismissal, only a calm acceptance that she'd forgotten could even exist. Her husband grew suspicious. He didn't understand why she'd slip away at odd times, brushing off his questions with vague answers. She could sense his frustration building, his looks growing sharper each time she made her excuses. He was already resentful of the time she spent with the donkey, though he never said it outright. His cold stares and muttered remarks said enough. But she couldn't stop. The pull was too strong, the quiet joy too rare to give up. So she made a choice. She kept her visits secret, finding new ways to slip away without being noticed. It felt strange, almost thrilling to have something of her own, a small corner of her life untouched by the constraints of marriage. It was her little act of rebellion, a hidden joy that her husband couldn't reach. She hadn't felt that way in years. In those moments, she felt free, liberated from the weight of a life that had grown gray and tired. With every touch, every shared moment, her bond with the donkey deepened. She didn't question it, didn't try to analyze why an animal's presence could mean so much. It was just there, a simple truth she held onto quietly, hidden from everyone, especially him. In those hidden moments, she felt alive again, as if she were remembering something essential that had been buried for too long. She became more careful, more intentional about her time with the donkey, savoring each moment with a kind of fierce tenderness. She was careful to keep it a secret, to protect this small, treasured part of herself from the eyes and words that wouldn't understand. In the donkey's calm gaze, she found a strange kind of companionship that brought her back to herself, a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. It was her secret, her solace, a bond that she knew she could never explain, and she was content to keep it that way. One evening, as she lingered longer than usual, Lost in the quiet presence of the donkey, she heard a sound behind her. She turned, her heart dropping. Her husband was standing there, watching her with a look she hadn't seen before, a mix of anger, confusion, and something that looked almost like betrayal. She froze, her mind racing as she struggled to find the words to explain, to somehow make him understand. But before she could speak, he took a step forward, his voice tense, sharp. "What are you doing out here, hiding from me like this?" he demanded, his voice low but brimming with resentment. She stammered, trying to find an explanation that wouldn't sound ridiculous, but everything she thought to say felt empty, pointless under his gaze. He took her silence as confirmation of something, though she wasn't sure what. He shook his head, his mouth a thin line as he looked from her to the donkey, anger flickering in his eyes. "So this is where you've been disappearing to," he said, his voice harsh. "You care more about this animal than you do about your own husband, don't you?" She tried to protest, to explain that it wasn't like that, but he cut her off, his frustration spilling out in words that struck deeper than she'd expected. "All this time I thought you were just busy with chores, but you're here talking to some animal like it's more important than me." She felt a surge of frustration rising in her chest, mingling with her guilt and confusion. Didn't he understand? Couldn't he see how empty things had become between them? But she couldn't find the right words, couldn't express the ache she'd carried alone for so long. Instead, she blurted out, "At least it listens to me. At least it doesn't make me feel alone." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Her husband's face shifted, his anger giving way to something softer, something that almost looked like hurt. He looked away, his shoulders slumping as if her words had hit him in a place he hadn't expected. For a long moment they stood there, the silence between them as thick as the tension that had been building for years. Neither of them knew what to say, how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "I didn't know you felt that way," he admitted, the edge in his voice softening. You never told me." She looked at him, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Would you have listened if I had?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer, and she realized that she didn't need him to. The truth was there, plain and undeniable. They stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken words and years of misunderstandings. She felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, as if a weight had lifted even as another took its place. She had kept her loneliness hidden for so long, thinking it was something she could bear on her own. But now, standing here, she realized that it was too much, that it had seeped into every part of her life, even into this strange bond she'd formed with the donkey. In that moment she saw their relationship clearly, the distance, the unspoken resentments, the quiet ways they had both given up. It was a painful truth, but a truth nonetheless, one that they could no longer ignore. And in that silence, she knew that things would never be the same between them, that this confrontation had laid bare everything they'd both tried to hide. As she stood there, the weight of years settling around her, she knew something had shifted irreversibly. Her husband's silence lingered, thick and heavy, but it also offered a strange kind of clarity. She realized she had spent so much time blaming him for her loneliness, for the emptiness that had quietly crept into her life. And yet, she was just as responsible for letting things decay, for allowing her own needs to become invisible, even to herself. That night, alone in their quiet home, she found herself replaying the confrontation, each word and unspoken thought settling deeper into her mind. The life she had imagined was far from the one she was living, and maybe it was time to admit that she had drifted as much as he had. She had turned to the donkey for comfort, but she saw now that it wasn't about the animal itself. It was a symbol of everything she'd lost, a reminder of the intimacy and connection she had yearned for. The donkey had become her confidant only because she'd hidden her true self, even from her husband. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She needed to find her own happiness, and for the first time, she understood that it wasn't going to come from outside herself. It wasn't something her husband could give her, and it wasn't something the donkey could replace. It was something she had to create, to reclaim piece by piece. She had spent so many years settling, convincing herself that silence and routine were enough. But standing at this crossroads, she saw how much she had been missing, how much she had let herself wither. The next morning, she walked to the field where the donkey waited, and for the first time, she didn't feel the same desperate need to unburden herself. She stroked its mane, feeling a quiet gratitude for the comfort it had given her, but she also knew it was time to let go. The donkey had been a refuge, but she didn't need it to be anymore. She realized she was strong enough to face her own pain, to confront the life she had been living without hiding behind the silent companionship of an animal. Later, she sat across from her husband at the kitchen table, a resolve in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. She started to speak, and this time she didn't hold anything back. She told him about her loneliness, about the ways they had both drifted, about her need for something real and meaningful. It wasn't an accusation, nor was it a plea for sympathy. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly, a declaration of everything she had buried and everything she was ready to reclaim. They talked for hours, peeling back years of silence and misunderstandings, finally facing the reality of what they had both allowed to happen. She didn't know if things would change between them, if they could rebuild something from the ashes of all they had ignored. But she knew one thing for certain. She was done hiding, done seeking comfort in places that couldn't truly heal her. She was ready to take control of her life, to start making choices that honored her own needs, her own happiness. As she walked back to the field one last time, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She said her silent goodbye to the donkey, grateful for the refuge it had offered, but ready to move forward. She was no longer the woman who needed to hide her feelings, who sought comfort in secret places. She was ready to face her life head-on, to find fulfillment on her own terms. And with that she walked away, her heart a little lighter, her path a little clearer.